Hello and welcome to Gardening, Cooking, and Nature-Based Learning with Young People. I'm Meredith Burks. I'm Seed Savers Exchange's Communication Director, and I'll be your host for this session. While I'm reviewing some housekeeping items, please invite you to put into the chat where you're joining us from. And do you have a favorite memory in nature or the garden from when you were a child? For me, I remember opening up the shells and eating peas right in my mother's garden. That's a very clear memory for me as a young child. So let me know what else you remember. First, I just want to say thank you to our sponsor, Organic Valley, for sponsoring this session. This session is being recorded and is going to be available to all attendees and registrants for a year. So once we wrap here, the video will be processed and you'll be able to find the recording on the session page. We have left time to take questions from the audience at the end, so feel free to utilize the chat throughout with your questions throughout the whole session. I would also like to just quickly acknowledge our community agreements. We ask that all participants in Seed the Future be respectful, be curious, be patient, speak from your own experiences, try to avoid jargon, be conscious of intent versus impact, be sure to take space and also make space, and take care of yourself. And Gabe, our chat moderator, has linked the full community agreements if you're interested in the chat. I'm going to welcome to the stage Alyssa and Sheila, and I'm just going to do a quick introduction here. Alyssa is a preschool teacher and mentor for student teachers at the University of Minnesota Child Development Lab School. She has a master's in education and a Minnesota teaching license in early childhood education and elementary education. She's also an instructor in the early childhood program at the University of Minnesota. And Sheila is the director of the University of Minnesota Child Development Lab School in Minneapolis. She has a bachelor's degree in biology, a graduate degree in education, and over 20 years of experience as an early childhood administrator and educator. Sheila is also the co-author of a wonderful book, Nature-Based Learning for Young Children, Anytime, Anywhere, on Any Budget, which is published by Redleaf Press, and several other publications through North American Association of Environmental Education, Minnesota Department of Education, and Environmental Kinship International. She serves on several boards that focus on early childhood education, equity, anti-bias education, environmental education, conservation, and K-12 education. Nature is all around us, and gardening in variety of spaces offers opportunities for children to create meaningful memories and knowledge. And today, Alyssa and Sheila, we're going to explore the wonderful world of gardening and cooking with young children. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for having us. We're very excited to just share our presentation with everyone and to have a little bit of dialogue at the end. So feel free to add questions when you have them, or you can save a little bit for the end. Alyssa and I are very passionate about this work, so we are trying to leave lots of room for discussion, but that we start to get into it because we love this work, and so we're excited to share that with you. Alyssa, any opening words you'd like to say?
Yeah, just thanks for joining us. Yeah, we're excited to be here with you all.
Yes. All right. And our program, the Child Development Laboratory School, serves children as young as 3 months old, all the way up until 5-year-olds. Every now and then there's a 6-year-old tossed in there, but most of the time until 5. And some of the children are there for as little as 3 hours a day, and some are there for as much as 10 hours a day. So there's a variety of experiences that young children have in our program, and we're looking forward to sharing some examples with you. So the first thing we just wanted to do is give you a layout of what we're going to talk about today. We'll start with the why garden with young children. If this is new for you, just a really short overview of that. We also want to go over some of the challenges that we face and that all people who work with young children may face. You may face other challenges, and you'll have a chance to talk about those too. We're going to share some curriculum examples, which we hope are very inspiring and also spark your interest. And then we'll do some tips for gardening with young children and also some tips for cooking with young children, because that's something that we both love to do as well. And we wanted to start out with a quote. And this is from a book about gardening with young children, and it's just about garden-based education as a philosophical orientation to teaching and learning that really uses the garden as that spark, as that inspiration for student engagement through meaningful and relevant curriculum and instruction throughout school. So this is a quote from Sheila Williams and her friends in this work. So I'm just going to start out a little bit with the why behind cooking with young or gardening with young children. And this is a picture of one of my daughters. I have four of them. And for me, the biggest reason to garden with young children is to bring joy and happiness into the lives of children. They are natural explorers and they want to be a part of things. And they also, if you know any young children, they have a lot of why questions. And the garden is a really wonderful place to just begin to expose them to things. And also that adults don't always have the answers because they'll ask, why is this taking so long? And we don't always have the answers for them. But there are also really kind of developmentally wonderful things that can aid children in their growth. And so we just, we also love gardening because it can be done anywhere. You can do some of it indoors, you can do some of it outdoors, you can do it all outdoors, you can do it all indoors, and you can really make it match where you live. It also helps children develop a sense of place. We'll get into that too. Just gardening supports development in all of the domains. There's so much literacy and vocabulary when you're talking about gardening with young children. There's so much fine motor skills and sorting seeds and planting seeds. And there's so much large motor when you have to dig and, pick things and harvest and carry heavy pumpkins, or in my garden right now, zucchini, you leave them for 2 days and then all of a sudden they're the size of a small child. So we have all of those things going on right now. And then you can use garden materials for math learning, for science learning. There's just so much that we can do. And so gardening really supports that across the domains for very young children. It also gives children opportunities to be immersed in learning, which is how we know young children, especially those between 2 and 5, learn best, is just to have chances to touch things and to smell things and to taste things, which the garden is really well known for. And you'll see a few photo examples here of ways that children have been able to engage in that kind of immersive experience where that's all they're interested in doing at the moment, and they have plenty of time to dig into it. It also often offers children a chance to strengthen their sense of place and of time because there's no rushing a garden. And also, the growing season, we're in Minnesota, and the growing season goes by faster than anyone would like it to. So, being engaged in the garden really helps children understand where we are, whether you're gardening with children in the Southwest or the Northeast or the West Coast or the East Coast. It's going to look different, and so children are starting to learn about where they are in the world and what that means, what it means to grow a garden in a different place. And these are a few examples because you can see that there are some things that will the garden can bring. We have these beautiful trees that provide a little bit of shade, and so children can do leaf jumping, and we also can do leaf prints and look at leaves and study them. But we also like to visit other gardens and see what people are doing in those spaces, and how we can learn from other gardens in our communities. Gardening also offers an opportunity to build community. So children will grow things together, they will plant together and weed together. And in the photo on the left, there were a couple of children that had an idea for a pumpkin patch. and it was part of the playground previously. And so we decided on the space, and then it was up to the community to really make that happen. And this was a group in Alyssa's class working on the garden, and establishing the pumpkin patch. And now, oh, I should have taken a picture, but now it is a thriving pumpkin patch. There's so many pumpkins because we just composted the pumpkins there to both add nutrients to the soil, but also, save your seeds. So the pumpkins started growing on their own in the spring. We composted the pumpkins there and covered it with a bed of straw. And in the spring, they started to sprout up, and we are very excited. And the children, I can't wait until the children get back and see it. They're going to be so excited. They're gone for the summer, but they'll be back in September, just in time. Our biggest thing, and if anyone has a way to get over this challenge, is there are lots of squirrels in Minneapolis. So we're going to try and keep the squirrels from eating all of the pumpkins, but I'm sure there are 50 pumpkin plants out there right now. So we're very excited about that. And then, building community, where if someone is gone from your community for a day or a week, that you can still have a chance to kind of catch them up and to keep them involved in the community, and show them like what happened while they were gone. And children get very excited to show, like, you were gone last week, but look how big this plant grew while you were gone. Like, we were watching it, and we were watering yours for you, because they might start individual seedlings in a little cup. And they can say, I took care of it for you while you're gone. I rely on people to take care of my garden when I'm gone as a grown up. So it's a wonderful chance for them to just learn about the community.
Yeah, and then there are also, of course, challenges that come along with gardening with young children. And so we're going to highlight just a couple of the big ones that we face. And a lot of them are very locationally based for us. As Sheila mentioned, we are in Minnesota, so we don't have the longest growing season. And then that is coupled with our school year. So I work with children from after Labor Day in September till mid-May. So that really does not give us a lot of time to really be planting outside, especially, and to be harvesting outside. Much of the growing season in Minnesota, almost all the growing season in Minnesota, is over our summer break, which makes us as teachers really have to think about how we're bringing that in a meaningful way for children.
Sorry. And the other thing is that thinking about especially seedlings in the garden, or picking things improperly, is that young children can take things pretty hard sometimes if they make a mistake. They're learning how to be resilient, and they're learning these skills. Nature-based learning has been shown to help children develop in a lot of different ways, but a lot of that is because they have a lot of experience doing it. And so we think about young children and the garden, what's growing in the garden, as being a little bit fragile in some ways. And how do we cultivate resilience in both of those? So for instance, if we have planted peas and one of the children goes to pull a pea off, and they pull too strong and they break it. And so then, the rest of the plant is done, and they are feeling bad about doing that. Also, the plant is no longer going to be producing. And so we really want to lean into those moments and talk to children about, that's why we plant more. This happens. Like, this is a way that you can, pick it in a different way. This is where you'll pinch it. This is, if you tug, this is what will happen. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing the challenges that come up, that we can. Obviously, we can't. Well, the growing season of Minnesota is changing, but not for the better. And so it is getting longer, but that's not what we want with climate change. But we do want children to help be more resilient. And we know that as gardeners, we're going to need to be more resilient, and we're going to really need to think about what we're planting, and if we have enough time, and if we have enough water resources, and what do we do? Because right now we're in a drought. And so what do we do in those spaces? How do we add resiliency to both ourselves and to the systems that we're working in? So that's another challenge that we are looking forward to continuing to lean into, but also doing work to try and prevent things when we can. So I also wanted to just touch on a few cultural considerations around the gardening. Many people have a complicated relationship with the land and working on the land, and we want to make sure that we are honoring those, and that we're honoring the challenges that maybe adults that we ask to volunteer may feel about being in the garden. But we also know that cultures have a really deep history with the land and food and producing food and harvesting food and foraging for food. And so we want to highlight those positive relationships while also ignoring any negative relationships, because that connection with land is really just important for all of us. In Minnesota, we have a lot of people who come from different places, and so the immigrant population is large, and we want to make sure that they can connect with the land as well as people who have been there for a long time or for many generations. um, and so figuring out and talking to people about what ways they would like to be involved in the garden. We invite families to be a part of the garden, and you'll see some photos a little bit later. But so there are lots of ways that we try and do that. But we want to make sure that we are honoring that. And then there are lots of cultural and family views on messy play and what it means to get dirty, and um, how they are supportive of it or not supportive of it. And so we want to make sure that we are talking to families about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what we can do. So at our school, we provide some outdoor gear, and families, if they don't want their children to get wet or muddy, we have like a suit from a company where we use Oki wear, and we have lots of extras, and we also ask children to provide it if they can. And it's one of those ways that we can honor families who want to send their children to school in kind of school clothes, but that at school we also have play clothes, and that they can do both of those things, because we know that for many families, school is a place that is seen as a formal learning environment. And this type of learning, although less formal, is even stronger. So we want to make sure that we are honoring the ways that children learn and continuing to lean into those. So now, if you have any questions specifically around anything that we've discussed already, go ahead and put those in the chat. We're going to switch gears a little bit and get into some curriculum examples.
Yeah, so I'm going to share with you all 2 examples from my own classroom, and then we'll also be sharing one from one of the full-day classrooms. For some context, the examples from my classroom, I work with children that are 3 to 5 years old, and I usually have around 18 children, so it's a fairly big group of kids that we're doing this work with. And then we spend most of our school day outside, which in some ways makes it really easy to do gardening, and then in other ways that I'll address like here makes it sometimes challenging too. So just some context as we jump in so you know where I'm coming from. The first example I'm going to share is a project that I did with children 2 years ago around mushrooms. We decided to grow mushrooms. Mostly it started with one child. We had one child that was so interested in mushrooms. He loved them so much, and he talked about them all year long. That was like a big focus of his conversations, of his play, of everything that he was doing at school. And as we got towards the end of the school year, other children started to be like, Alyssa, why does he talk about mushrooms so much? Like, what's so great about mushrooms? And so at that point, as like a whole class, we were like, okay, we're curious about mushrooms. I did some research and I was like, oh, we can grow mushrooms. It was really nice. Mushrooms were a really accessible thing for us to grow. We started them in kind of late March, early April, I believe, and it was something that we were able to do inside. So we were able to grow it regardless of the snow that was still on the ground when we started them. And so, yeah, it was really nice that we could do that really at any time and have a really meaningful growing experience regardless of kind of what was happening outside. Another thing is that they grow really quickly in ways that I sometimes found quite shocking. I had to take them home over one weekend, and I was like telling all my friends about how insane it was about how quickly they grew. And that is a really big benefit, especially with young children having something that grows quickly, because, they are not always able to wait that long to see things grow. And it's hard for them to keep track of time and to know how long is it going to take for this seed that I planted to actually grow. So this was really fun to see a product so quickly. And then finally, like every other kind of area gardening, like Sheila already mentioned, we were able to tie this into all areas of learning. The work we do at school is play-based. So children are playing all day, and we're just really intentional as teachers about how we are bringing different topics and different skills into that play. And mushrooms were no exception to that. We brought them into everything. We can go to the next slide. Thanks, Sheila. So how did we do this? Well, we already had that base interest of children talking about mushrooms and wanting to know more about them. So to start, we just kind of brought those mushroom kits to our large group that we have every day, and we talked about what it meant to grow mushrooms. We read through the directions together, and I explained to them what the process was going to be, and then we did it. And then every day we got to check on those mushrooms, and since they grow so fast, we got to see really noticeable changes every day. And the children were a part of the care of the mushrooms. They were pretty low maintenance, the ones we had. They just needed to be spritzed twice a day. And so the children helped with that task on a daily basis too. We also, well, especially while we were waiting for the first mushrooms to fruit, we also spent a lot of time talking about the life cycle. In the picture in the corner, you can see a child pointing to a picture we had made of the mushroom life cycle, and he was talking about what stage he thought the mushrooms were at currently. And that was a really fun way to tie in the science and to tie in the whole cycle that we were going to experience. And then we brought mushrooms into kind of all of the areas of play that we were doing. We were reading stories, which there are not a lot of great stories I found for young children about mushrooms. So if anyone's interested in writing children's books about mushrooms, we could really use more of them. And then we were incorporating that into our art. We had pictures by our painting wall, pictures by our journal so that children could draw mushrooms or paint them. And then the children also naturally just brought it into all the other things. So they were building mushrooms with blocks. They were building mushrooms with pine cones. Basically, any kind of natural material could become a mushroom for play purposes. If we had Play-Doh out, they were making Play-Doh mushrooms. It really became a part of what we were doing at school and that the children were really aware of. Finally, we had our mushrooms and we got to harvest them, which was a really exciting experience because definitely one of the biggest challenges at first was having children not pull the mushrooms right out of the block before we were really ready to use them. So we had a lot of conversations about how to touch them gently and how we look at them and how we were going to wait and have a time where we were going to have the really satisfying moment of pulling them off of the block, but we had to wait for a little bit. And once we did that, we cooked them. So Sheila helped us first by making us some delicious sauteed mushrooms. And then for our second harvest, we made some mushroom pizza, which the children helped vote on what they wanted to make with those. All right. And then I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about all of the amazing skills that we got to practice through just growing these mushrooms. The first was like writing and literacy skills. So that picture is of a child's journal, and they had wrote the mushrooms are connected. So we had been talking about how the mycelium all kind of comes together before the mushrooms actually fruit. And so that was a really important note for her to put and something that was really significant to her. So she wrote that with some support from a teacher. But what a beautiful display of writing, especially at such a young age. Other children who weren't quite at the point where they were writing full sentences, because that's pretty advanced, did things like drawing mushrooms, as you can see there, which was a really beautiful way for them to communicate their experience with this project in a really meaningful way. And then, of course, science was all around us. That picture of the table was kind of our science station that we ended up setting up inside the building so that the whole school could see what we were working on. And we had magnifying glasses so that anybody could go up and observe the mushrooms. We were having so many discussions about what mushrooms needed to grow, if it was the same as all other plants, if it was the same as animals, if it was the same as people. So really great conversations around that. And then we were doing so much predicting and monitoring growth. So we were constantly predicting which mushrooms were going to grow first, the pink ones or the blue ones, which ones were going to grow the biggest, would they look the same? So there was a lot of thinking and observing and predicting throughout the whole process. And then also a lot of practicing of social skills. So this picture is of two children. One child was journaling his prediction of what he thought thought the mushrooms were going to look like. And the other child was really interested. And this was a child that wasn't always as intrigued by his peers, but because he was so excited about mushrooms, went up and asked a peer about what he was drawing. And there was a lot of conversation amongst the children about what are these mushrooms going to look like? What are we going to do with them? And that was really, really lovely to see. And then gross motor skills. That pile of children were enacting the life cycle of a mushroom. So as a way to make the life cycle of mushrooms a little bit more appealing and meaningful to young children, we ended up acting out the various stages. So if I remember correctly, in this picture, they were crawling together like the mycelium to get ready to fruit into mushrooms. Very entertaining, very fun and meaningful way to explore that topic. And then math was all around us. We were constantly measuring the mushrooms. We were marking it out on graphs. We were making graphs about the growth of mushrooms and about our different predictions. So we were able to tie a lot of math into it as well. And then art, I already mentioned, we did some painting with mushrooms. In this picture, you can see the children were painting on that white sheet of paper, and we had some examples of various mushrooms up so that if they felt like they wanted to bring that into their art, they could. So yeah, the next example I'm going to share, Sheila already touched on this one a little bit, but is the pumpkin patch project that we did. So this was a project from this past school year. And once again, child interest was kind of the big motivator for working on this project. The same child that loves mushrooms really loves pumpkins. And I had the honor of having him for 2 years and of him having really strong interests that really engaged other children, which was really powerful to see. And of course, I would say, especially around fall and around Halloween in particular, a lot of the children in our class were just talking about pumpkins anyway. So we had already done a ton of explorations around pumpkins. We'd done pumpkin experiments. We'd painted pumpkins. We'd carved pumpkins. We'd cooked with pumpkins. We had did so many things. And so we had kind of reached this point where we had all these pumpkins and we're like, they're starting to rot. What do we do? Like, we could compost them, like we've done that in the past, which is a valid option, but we're like, is there a way to give them more life? And a couple of children had mentioned going to pumpkin patches. So we were like, hey, that sounds great. Let's make a pumpkin patch. And it was a nice way to use our pumpkins and give them new life in a really exciting way. This was also really exciting because it allowed for a long-term exploration. The mushroom example was a really short-term, like that was really only a couple weeks from starting our mushrooms to harvesting our final batch, whereas the pumpkin patch was going to be quite a long process. We had to make the pumpkin patch and then we would plant our pumpkins and then we would have to wait a full year plus, honestly, to see the fruits of some of that labor. So that was exciting to be able to work on such a big project. So a lot of our learning around pumpkins had already kind of happened up to this point, which was really nice. Now it was a lot about the application. So the pumpkin patch project was really big. We had talked about where we were going to put it. We had decided where the pumpkin patch was going to be, and then we had to get to work. And this was no small feat for young children. We had to move wood chips, which is what you can see children doing in here. And then there was a layer of fabric or a landscape fabric underneath the wood chips. So then we had to remove the landscaping fabric before we could finally toss in all of our rotten pumpkins and cover them with straw and then wait. And it was really powerful to see the children working together on this project. It took a few weeks to get all of these steps done. And the children kind of found different jobs that they really enjoyed doing. Some loved scooping the wood chips. Some loved running their wheelbarrows and being crazy wheelbarrow drivers and bringing the wood chips off to the spot we were bringing them. Some liked to be the foreman and just supervise. That was the term that they used, and just make sure that everything was going okay. So it was a really cool opportunity to see some collaboration. And then we invited a bunch of people to take part. So once again, like I mentioned, we covered all the areas of development again, just like with the mushrooms. And like Sheila had mentioned, at this point, we were focused more on the community aspect and like just the working aspect, but leading up to it, we had done literacy practice and math and all sorts of other domains. But then, as I mentioned, I think the biggest and most rewarding part of this project, especially as a teacher, was just being able to work as a group on something, especially something that not everyone was going to get to see the results of. At the end of our school year, there was nothing growing in the pumpkin patch yet. Thankfully, our summer camp got to visit for one day, and there were finally a few plants, and the children in my class ran right over and were so excited to see. But most of them are not going to get to see anything until the fall, and then they will come back to, hopefully, as Sheila mentioned, lots of pumpkins. We will see. So yeah, it was just a really cool chance to work together as a group towards a common goal.
And sorry, Alyssa, kind of transfer the
Oh, you're good.
slide a little bit early, but you were going to, I think, mention that children also brought like pumpkins from home.
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone was bringing like rotten pumpkins
Yeah,
from
and like the
their,
whole school we invited to bring their
yeah.
pumpkins. Yeah.
So there were a lot of, and so we
Yeah.
don't know exactly what kind of pumpkins are growing in there. It's going to be a surprise. And we talk to children about that too, right? Like sometimes if you don't remember what that exact seed came from, it's going to be a surprise, and it's still going to be pretty wonderful. And then I did
Yeah.
see a note in the chat about how children bring learning home. And I wonder if you could talk about that just a little bit. Oh, and I see it right popping up right there.
Oh, yeah, that's a really lovely question. Well, so some of it I know children were talking about at home because I talked to their parents about it, and their parents would come up and say, they've only been talking about the pumpkin patch. Or like we had fall conferences around the time that we were doing this. And one of the questions I always ask families is, what are your children talking about at home about school? And that was probably the overwhelming response that I got that fall of like, children are talking about the pumpkin patch. This is something that they're working really hard on. And I think with young children, we don't always hear a ton. They don't always tell their children parents a ton. And so it was really exciting to see children want to bring their parents into the playground to show them the pumpkin patch. So that's some of the biggest things that we saw from that.
And then we do provide weekly documentation about what learning is happening. So families were seeing these photos kind of in time as they were coming up.
Mhm.
But yeah, it was really, I think, positive feedback. And I think the parents are just as excited as the children of seeing, like, did this work out? Because they were like bringing in pumpkins and carrying it all and doing all that stuff. So I think they're pretty excited.
Yes, absolutely. So now we're going to share a brief example from some of our colleagues. This is from a toddler classroom that's in the full day portion of our program. So they are working with children for up to 10 hours a day and year round. So they get to be there in the summer, in the main kind of growing season, to do some work then. So one thing that was really exciting about this project was just how long it gets to run. So this group of toddlers started their growing, I think they really started in like February or March, where they started uh, tasting different herbs and talking about what they might be interested in growing before finally selecting their seeds, which you see here, and then working together to plant them and start them inside. So in this third picture, you can see the child is watering and caring for their plants inside. And then after the plants had grown indoors for a long time, they got to transplant them outdoor to our outdoor gardens, and now they're still getting to spend the summer caring for them, and they'll get to harvest them eventually.
And here's where I mentioned a little bit earlier about having families involved. So, gardening with toddlers, obviously, if you know any toddlers, they may pick things that they're not supposed to. They don't stay on task for a long, long time. But when they're doing things with a grown up, like one on one, they can stay engaged and really get into it. And also, they can start to differentiate things. They may still pick some things that you wanted to stay in the ground, or maybe miss some weeds, but they don't garden independently at this time. That's something for more elementary age children. Usually very young children need some very explicit directions and someone there present with them in the garden. But our families are so wonderful, and they came for a gardening day with this class. They made donations of plants like they did of the pumpkins. They gave their time during the day to come over and help put together these. Even these garden beds were made by parents the year before. So there was something different in them the year before, and then this year they were planting these things. Families also offer to help with things like watering and weeding, and the summer harvest can be helpful to, especially for those classrooms or those spaces that are on an academic calendar, so that if they're only running September to May, having families come and do all of those things is really, really important, especially as we are seeing that we are moving into a time where the rain is not as predictable, I would say, because Minnesota's in a drought right now. And so having those families there has been really amazing. And the next thing we wanted to do is share a few resources with you that we really love. And so I wanted to start with some kind of growing food, especially thinking about the cultures of the families that you may have in your programs or that you want to work with. And so these are just a few, and I believe that Seed Savers is putting together a resource page about these. It may be in the handout section. Um, of this webinar, but you can see a wide variety of food. And I actually got these from Sheila Williams, who has a book on gardening with young children and especially on multicultural aspects. And so she actually put together these two slides about some of her favorite books around picture books about food and growing your own food and what that means. And there are more and more just continuing to come out all of the time. So I think keeping an eye on those and thinking about which ones really focus on the families that you serve in your programs. And then just another few of our favorites from around school, depending on the year, are these, especially in the fall when we are starting back up, talking about harvest days and what that means. It can be a really wonderful community builder and way to start your school year by harvesting and then cooking things together or having children bring things in. We use books like Harvest Days, but also books like Stone Soup to talk to children about vegetables and about community and about collaboration and that we are all better when we do things together. And I also wanted to mention there's now a new book award called the Blueberry Awards, and I forgot to look up the link for that, but it's a way that you can find kind of books around nature for young children. And like I said, there are new books coming out all the time. So this is a really wonderful way to find some resources for that. And then these are some books for adults. So the first book on the left is the one that Meredith mentioned at the beginning. This is a book that I worked on with my colleague, Julie Powers. So it's nature-based learning for young children, anytime, anywhere, on any budget. And it really does focus on that you can do this inside, outside, and in any kind of ecosystem. Julie and I are both from the desert, and so we talk about what that feels like, but we also work in two very different ecosystems now. And so what you can do in those spaces, there are wonderful, wonderful things about all of the spaces that children are present, and how do we highlight those for them. And also, if you don't have access to lots of funds, it can be really important to find what things are free. So you can take a look at that. If you'd like. And then the Learning Gardens and Sustainability Education. This is the book from Sheila Williams that I have mentioned before. And it really is focused on gardening and bringing life to kind of schools through gardening. If you are interested in the work with preschool age children, so generally 3 to 5, sometimes 2 to 5, there's the Nature-Based Preschool Professional Practice Guidebook, and it does talk about how to scaffold that learning for young children in your programs. And then before we get into a little bit of kind of the cooking part of today, I wanted to share a few of my favorite resources for cooking with young children. So the first one is Simply in Season Children's Cookbook, and it does things that children find fun. The recipes themselves are fun, but also the ways that it explains to children like what vegetables or what fruits really play well together. So what you can cook together. There is a Simply in Season for grown-ups. I use both of these pretty often, and they are usually pretty allergy friendly, but definitely watch out for any allergens that you find or that you may have present with the people that you're working with. The next book is the Good Berry Cookbook, and this is more native foods to where I live in Minnesota. And so there are berries and wild rice and things that you can find naturally. So when we forage or when we're looking for things that are local and native to the space, this is a really good cookbook to think about what can I do with these ingredients and what is edible and how will children enjoy it? How can I prepare it so that children will enjoy it? And then there's another book, the Molly Katzen Salad People, is just a fun book for children to look through. I often have it in a literature area of the classroom so that they can think about that. And as children start to show interest, I would say, oh, if we were going to cook something from here, like what would we make? I've also learned that that's one of those books that really shows children what a recipe is and how a recipe works. So that's a fun book for really thinking about the process of cooking and what that looks like for children. All right, Alyssa's going to take this one.
Yeah, so now we're going to just kind of jump into our tips section. So I'm going to share some tips on gardening, and then Sheila will share some tips on cooking. So of course, with all the work that we're doing, we want to make sure that safety is a priority. We really want to be intentional, especially with tools, about giving tools that they are competent with, that they are experienced with, and that they're able to use safely. And if we cannot give them like the normal adult tools, thinking about what we can give instead. I think a good example of this that we use at school is shovels. We have some like child-sized metal shovels. They're probably like 3 feet, but they do have a metal blade. That could be dangerous if used inappropriately. And it's something that I generally really love to use with children if we've had chance to practices and if the children have the awareness to be safe with them and to know where other people's bodies are in relation to the shovels. Of course, under an adult supervision. But sometimes that's not something that our class can safely do, in which case we have a ton of different plastic shovels that we can use, and some of which are big shovels that they can utilize to move large quantities of dirt or wood chips or whatever they're shoveling with. And then another part of that is making sure that you have enough tools. It's really hard to watch a bunch of people garden and not have the things that you want to be gardening with too. So generally having enough tools for the children or for each child to have something is really helpful, especially at this age. Sometimes it's an option, so at least making sure that you can switch them out fairly often so that everyone is feeling like they're getting a chance to do the work that they want to be doing is really, really important to helping them stay engaged in the process of gardening. And then we want to be giving children really clear guidelines about what we're doing in the garden. And so that is firstly around the tools, like what expectations you have for the tools, how are children using those tools. So like, right, when we were using the shovels, we say like, oh, the shovel blade is like staying towards the ground unless you're lifting it to dump things. And like, we're not putting the shovels above our heads, things like that. And then also like, what are the children supposed to be doing during whatever you're working on? So for example, this past spring, we did some gardening. We grew some pepper and tomato seeds indoors using our grow table. So when I was planning for that, I made sure that we had our materials ready and that when we got together as the group, I was like, okay, I told the children the steps that we were doing so that they knew what to expect. And then as we went, kind of let them know, remind them of what we were doing in each of those steps. As much as possible, we try to limit saying no to the children because that is really frustrating when you're excited about learning. And so giving clear expectations and being prepared really helps limit those no's, which we found to be really, really helpful. I kind of already started the planning and assembling what you need ahead of time. So that example that I shared from this past spring of planting, I had a bucket of children's gardening gloves. I had our containers already prepped that we were planting in. I had our bag of soil and I had our seeds all ready to go so that when it was time to do our planting, the children didn't have to wait for me to go get the things that they needed. We could sit down, we could talk about what we were doing, and we could get to work right away. And that just makes the process way easier and helps ensure that your expectations are getting met and that the children are actually going to get to do the work that they want to do too in a really meaningful way. And then planning for children with different levels of comfort with soil, bugs, etc. Yeah, some kids are not going to want to touch dirt. And so that's where things like having gardening gloves and having different tools really comes in handy because then they don't have to. We have a lot of conversation around bugs. Generally, my classes have had more conversations around how to be really kind to bugs rather than being worried about bugs, but it's like fear of bugs also comes up. And generally we're just talking about how bugs are living creatures, that this is their home and that we're going to respect that. If children are worried about them, we don't make them like touch bugs or anything like that, but we just help them know, yep, like it's okay. They're here. Everything's fine. We as adults will make sure that you are okay around this. And then just allowing for fun, of course. Ultimately, our hope is that this is a lot of fun for you and for children, that this isn't something that feels challenging or draining, but is something that is really meaningful. And sometimes that means you take a break from the actual planting of seeds and you sit there and you talk about seeds for a while because they're just so intrigued about what the seeds look like and why the pepper seeds look different than the tomato seeds, and things like that. So yeah, just giving lots of space for children to enjoy themselves. and yourself.
And I just wanted to add that we also talk with children about, because sometimes we sometimes will order like praying mantis because they're good bugs, but we really talk to children about that there's no such thing as a bad bug necessarily. Like the bug is just living its bug life, and it doesn't need to, it's not out there to like destroy your garden. And so I sometimes start by asking the children, do you think that these bugs know that we planted this so that we have food? Like, do you think that they know that thing? Or like, why do you think they're eating this thing? And so we just talk about that. I mean, bugs are living their own purposeful lives, and that is a wonderful thing. But there are some bugs that we don't want in our garden because we planted these things. It doesn't mean that they can't exist, but it does mean that we're going to move them. And so sometimes I'll have a little jar and we'll gather those grubs and we'll go put them in a place that has a bunch of weeds. And so we talk about that because we want children to respect others who have different ways of living, others who may, think differently than they do, but that we want to make sure that we are not kind of going out there and kind of sorting the world by good and bad, because it's always more complex than that. And so I'm going to get into a couple of the tips for cooking with young children. So I will always, so in this picture, it was the first time with one of these. It's a sharper knife, and I give children. This is a 4-year-old, so I give them the option of if they want to use like a pumpkin cutter or if they'd like to use a real knife. And so I show them how to do it, and so it is a little bit hands-on if they want to use a real knife. And then once they are comfortable with that tool, then they can do it independently. This child, of course, had used the pumpkin carvers in the past and was really ready, instead of doing the sawing, to get something that really kind of cuts through. If you've ever tried to cut apples with a pumpkin carver, like that can be a little bit frustrating. So we want children to love cooking. We don't want it to be frustrating, but we want them to have experience. So I just have the rule of one knife per adult, one sharp thing per adult. That way I know that the child is getting all of the support and scaffolding that they need for that thing. I follow the same rule with saws or hammers. Just one danger per adult is kind of the rule that we live by. And that way we can make sure to help support them when they need it. And then just keeping the recipes simple. We often will take a complicated recipe and just like make it simpler for children by putting a board up that shows like, 2 pictures of an apple, and it says we need 2 apples, and then it has a knife and it says we're going to chop these 2 apples, and just really making it simple, or as simple as possible, to keep the children engaged. And so making sure that they always have something to do, whether they're measuring or pouring or stirring. It's one of the kind of really nice ways to keep them engaged. Just like with gardening, plan and assemble what you need ahead of time, because you definitely don't want to have to step away when you're doing a cooking project. Because, I mean, frankly, if you do, someone will sneeze while you're gone, and then you have to start all over.
Or eat a bunch of your ingredients.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, or if they stick their finger in and start tasting. Yeah, there are always things. So plan and assemble everything that you need. I am always prepared to do the cooking project indoors or outdoors. So make sure that you have what you need if you were going to do this inside, or make sure you have what you need if you're going to do it outside. And then have a hand washing station nearby. We have some that can go outside, but we also have hand washing inside. Make sure it has the stool if you need a stool. And then just supporting children that have different experiences with food in a positive way. So if someone says, I don't like that, and you'll say, oh, like, what are the parts of it that you didn't like? And if they say, oh, I've never tasted it before, and I was like, oh, well, how do you know you don't like it? Right? Like asking questions about them in a very positive way, and not forcing children to taste things that they don't want to. The very first time that I made a beet chocolate cake with children, they were like, I don't like beets personally. Sorry, probably shouldn't have said that to the whole world, but I don't like beets. But I can do them in chocolate cake. And so I tell children that, like, what, sometimes when I taste this vegetable, it doesn't make my, my mouth very happy. But when I do this to it, I really, really like it. This is a way that I like to enjoy it. And so I say, you can try it if you'd like to, but you don't have to. This is a choice for you. We want children to have a positive relationship with food and not feel as though it is something that is that they kind of have to do. And then the next thing I wanted to get into is just some cooking tools with children. I think have lots of good wooden spoons that have a little bit of a bowl there, not too flat, because if it is, it kind of acts like a spatula and they just like stuff flies around. So I think investing in a good quality wooden spoon, or at least a good shaped one, making sure that the handle. Sorry, I pulled up the second thing, but making sure that the handle isn't too long, but also isn't too short, especially thinking about the size bowl that you're going to use. So if you have short sticks on the spoon, make sure that you're using really short bowls. And I would always say to go for a bigger bowl with young children and something that has a weighted bottom. So I showed a picture of these. I tend to use a glass bowl that has a heavy bottom, but there are also some good metal ones. And then having a lid on them, because you never know what will happen while you're cooking. If you're like, oh, so someone's like, I have to go to the bathroom. So you can quick put the lids on, go to the bathroom, wash hands, come back. So you can be flexible. So I really like metal bowls with a lid. Or when I'm using the glass bowl, I have a plate nearby that can act as a lid, especially if we're outside and I need it to be covered while we're gone. And then the other thing is good vegetable peelers that have a nice handle that children can use. And I suggest getting both of these styles of potato peelers, or we use these peelers for lots of different things. We can also use them for whittling with sticks if children aren't comfortable with knives yet. But making sure that you have two different kinds so that children can kind of practice. Those are two very different types of motor activities. So all right, a couple of other like essential, I'm supposed to end in a minute, that I think are great for the Midwest in particular. So apple peeler cores, one, very satisfying to use. Be ready to repair it every season, just do, because they always need a little bit of repair. But I have several of these. I like the kind that clamp to the table, but they're also the kind like in this picture that are suction. And that works well too. But I do prefer the kind that clamp to the table because children will move that lever around and then you have to kind of start over. But this saves so much time, especially if you're doing things like applesauce, apple pie, apple crisp, whatever you're doing. You can get through 5-10 pounds of apples in a pretty fast time if you have one of these. Also, we eat the peels, and so then that's something really satisfying that the children can do right then, is just eat the curly peels. And so I just say, how many curly peels do you want? And we'll see how many they have. And then good small knives for children. So these are some that are recommended for cooking with young children. If you're not sure of the children's ability, like I said, you can use pumpkin carvers, or the the fifth one over is a plastic knife. And so that is a way that you can do it too. And then I have this I have a rocket chef, and I don't know if any of you have ever used that, but you can make salsa like right at the garden. So all you need is a cutting board, a knife, and this rocket chef, and your ingredients. And the only things you usually have to bring out with you are lime and salt. And you can like cut a tomato in half, put it right in there. It's a little food processor, but it's manual, so there's no electricity. And it is a really wonderful thing for children to just be able to use. And then, of course, popsicle molds, because you can just blend all the things from the garden, fruits, vegetables. You can do a combination of the two. And and you can make popsicles, and all children really love that. So I tried to speed through those, but we have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone has them. Alyssa, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, thank you all so much. We're happy for any questions. I see Meredith, you're back in here.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to pop back on and say that was really wonderful. And yes, if you have any questions, add them in the chat. And I loved the presentation. I did not disclose earlier that I actually used to work at Redleaf Press, and I worked with Sheila on that book, Nature-Based Learning for Young Children. And one thing that I really miss from my time at Redleaf is just being able to hear these stories about child-led projects and curriculums, and just how kids can get so obsessed with one topic and see them to come together as a community. It's really, really fun to see that again. And I saw somebody in the chat mentioned that they actually teach upper elementary. And so I'm hoping that they're getting a lot of how that could translate maybe for older children, but I didn't know if you could maybe speak to any experiences you may have, or if you have colleagues doing similar work with older children.
I can start if Alyssa wants to think about it, but Sheila Williams, the one that had the other book there, she mostly works with elementary and upper elementary age children. And so just there's so many great resources for working with elementary age children. And I think in particular, cooking can be a little bit more challenging just because of how many children are in a classroom. So thinking about ways that you can do that safely, volunteers that you could maybe get that day, if you can bring in other volunteers, or if you have a couple of parents that might be able to join you. I did a making fry bread with a class, and it was a great experience, but it did take us being in a classroom with 30 children, and I basically had them just work the dough while they were waiting for their turn to fry, because again, you want to keep children engaged. You don't want them to have time where they're not doing anything. So I think that engagement and really planning for that is really important. Like, what could they be doing if a teacher is busy doing this thing? Like with the frying, I had to be doing that part, so someone else was giving out dough and someone was talking to them about stretching, and we were doing different things around the room. But that engagement piece, I think, is even more important when you have classes of more. We generally have classes between 15 and 18 children, but when you have classes of 20 to 30 children, doing some of these projects can be challenging.
Yeah, when I think I've worked a little bit with some older elementary, especially like in schooling, and done some gardening with them. And I think the biggest change that I kind of saw from the work that I'm doing now with younger children is that there's a little bit more freedom. A lot of times it's a lot more collaborative getting to the point of the planting. It's like, instead of me being like, okay, here are all the things that we need to plant, it could be more of a group effort to have them work together to figure out what they need to plant, and to execute the thing. Giving the children more control instead of more teacher control, as we have with younger kids, is probably the biggest change that I've seen in gardening with older children.
I would also add that, just like for young children, the developmental domains, not thinking about cooking as just a sensory experience, but also thinking about all of the math and all the chemistry. I mean, cooking is such great chemistry, especially baking. And so thinking about all of the chemistry and all of the, how big does this get, and all the measuring that children can do, but also all the art, having children paint fruits and vegetables that they find, or just every developmental domain for any aged person can be totally met through these experiences.
Yeah. And I do always just love the social emotional development too, kind of what you're talking about, like, we are going to work together to do this, or we're going to share this food together too. And I don't know, I really loved hearing about how you communicate with children about food, whether it's taste or, if they don't like something, not forcing them, but asking questions. I think as somebody who had an experience with a child that was a quote unquote picky eater, and I did not have the language to communicate with them on, and it was just a battle every single time. And if I could go back in time, I would change that. But yeah, no, I think I really appreciate the work that you both are doing in instilling just a love of gardening and food in these young children. I think those are going to be really important skills that translate forever. And we are just about at time. So thank you both for joining us today. And thank you to Gabe, our chat moderator, who's been sharing a lot of the resources in the links. Just want to remind our audience too that we have our final keynote in about 15 minutes with Sam Jett and Sean Brock. So I hope everyone will be able to join us. But thank you, Alyssa and Sheila, for being here. Thank you to our audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.